Los Angeles in the 1960s was a city split in two. Beneath the golden sunsets and the glamour of Hollywood, there was another world, the narrow streets of Pico Union, where families lived stacked in crumbling apartments and children played beside graffiti-covered walls that told stories of forgotten wars. The city had promised these families a better life. But for many immigrants from Mexico, El Salvador and Guatemala, Los Angeles was not a land of dreams. It was a battlefield without borders, where identity, survival and belonging were constant wars of their own. In those years, the older, more established Mexican-American gangs ruled the neighborhoods with a fierce sense of pride and exclusion. The Clanton 14s, one of the oldest gangs in LA, saw themselves as the true heirs of the streets. Chicanos born and raised in the United States, fluent in English and Spanish, carrying an identity forged through generations. But when younger immigrants, many still struggling with the language and carrying deep scars from poverty and displacement, tried to join their ranks, they were turned away. "You're not one of us," they were told. And so, rejection became the seed of rebellion. That rejection, in the dusty corners of Pico Union, gave birth to something that no one, least of all those teenagers, could have imagined would one day span continents. They called themselves Clanton 18, a name meant to affiliate them with the Clanton 14s, their older rivals. But it didn't last long. When the Clanton gang discovered this new clique trying to carry their name, they made it clear that there would be no shared legacy, no brotherhood. The young men of Pico Union had no choice but to stand on their own. Out of that defiance came a new name, one that would echo through decades of urban history: the 18th Street Gang. In the beginning, 18th Street wasn't a criminal empire, it was survival. These were kids barely out of school, hustling for a place in a society that didn't want them. Police harassment was constant, opportunities were rare, and systemic racism marked every part of daily life. The streets became their classroom, their shelter, and their battlefield. Their loyalty was not born from crime, but from protection. Protection from other gangs, from racist violence, from the feeling of being invisible. Yet in the chaos of survival, something darker began to grow: a culture of power. As the 1970s arrived, the landscape of Los Angeles began to shift. The civil rights movement had given rise to new forms of identity and resistance. But for many of these young Latinos, the fight wasn't in the courts or the universities. It was in the alleys. The city's police department declared war on gangs, but each crackdown only made them stronger. When officers raided homes, arrested members, and filled prisons, the message that echoed through the community wasn't fear, it was unity. Every blow from the system only pushed the members closer together, bound by a shared rage and a shared dream. Respect, no matter the cost. The 18th Street Gang became known for one thing that made them stand apart from everyone else: their openness. While other gangs kept strict ethnic boundaries, 18th Street accepted anyone who shared their struggle. Mexicans, Salvadorans, African Americans, Asians, whites, it didn't matter. If you lived in the neighborhood, if you stood up for your people, if you were willing to fight, you were in. That inclusivity became both their strength and their weapon. It allowed them to grow faster than any other gang in the city, building a network of cliques that stretched across neighborhoods like spiderwebs. Each clique had its own rules, its own leaders, but all of them carried the same identity: 18. The number was more than a street name. It was a statement, a symbol of resistance against exclusion. To wear the number meant you belonged to something bigger than yourself, something that gave meaning in a world that offered none. Graffiti marked walls like declarations of independence: Extinct, Dieciocho, 18th Street. For many young men and women, it was the first time they felt truly seen. But power comes with its own poison. As the gang grew, so did its violence. Rivalries turned into blood feuds, and the original dream of unity began to blur under the weight of crime. Drug dealers, hustlers, and enforcers began to mix with the original members, changing the gang's rhythm from survival to domination. By the end of the 1970s, the 18th Street Gang had evolved from a group of outcasts into one of Los Angeles' most feared organizations. Police files described them as the most rapidly expanding street gang in California. Their graffiti wasn't just on Pico Union walls anymore, it was spreading across the city. The irony was cruel. What started as a fight for belonging had become a force of terror in the very neighborhoods that birthed it. Parents warned their children to stay away from Los Dieciochos, yet many of those same children would later join. The streets offered what society denied: family, identity, and a place to be respected. The price was steep, but in a world where hope was rationed, even fear could feel like power. By the early 1980s, the foundations of what would become a transnational empire were already in place. The 18th Street Gang had built a model of recruitment that was decentralized, adaptable, and deeply personal. Anyone could form a clique, anyone could represent the 18 as long as they followed its codes. It was anarchic, yet organized, chaotic, yet united by a single symbol. That was their genius and their curse. And so, in the alleys of Pico Union, beneath the endless hum of Los Angeles traffic, a new kind of empire was born. Not from wealth, not from politics, but from the raw need to belong. The teenagers who once fought for a corner of their neighborhood had lit a spark that would one day spread across continents. The rebellion of the forgotten had found its name and its number. By the early 1980s, Los Angeles was a city under siege. The 18th Street Gang had grown from a handful of teenagers in Pico Union into a sprawling constellation of neighborhood cliques that stretched across the county. Their symbols appeared everywhere, on walls, bus stops, school fences, and freeway overpasses. The number 18 had become a kind of urban signature, a mark of belonging that no one could ignore. For the police, it was graffiti. For the members, it was a declaration of existence. The beauty and the danger of 18th Street's structure lay in its flexibility. There was no single boss, no rigid hierarchy like in traditional mafia families. Each clique operated independently, often led by a local shot caller who answered only to respect and survival. Yet despite their autonomy, they all shared one banner: loyalty to La Dieciocho. This decentralized structure made them incredibly difficult to dismantle. When the LAPD targeted one cell, another would rise elsewhere. When one leader was arrested, two more would take his place. The gang's identity wasn't tied to an individual. It was an idea, and ideas are harder to kill than people. During these years, Los Angeles was being transformed by two forces: mass immigration and the crack cocaine epidemic. As waves of Central American refugees arrived in California, fleeing civil wars and political chaos, they entered neighborhoods already fractured by poverty and violence. Many of these young men had seen war before. They carried scars, both visible and invisible. For them, the streets of Los Angeles were just another battlefield, and the 18th Street Gang offered the same thing the military once did: structure, loyalty, and protection. The 18th Street's open-door policy became a magnet for these displaced youths. Unlike other gangs that demanded ethnic purity or neighborhood lineage, 18th Street embraced diversity as a weapon. Anyone could join if they proved loyalty. This policy didn't just expand their numbers, it diversified their skills, languages, and territories. Salvadorans brought intensity and discipline. Mexicans brought street knowledge. African Americans brought connections to other criminal networks. The gang became a microcosm of Los Angeles itself, chaotic, multicultural, and dangerous. At the same time, the crack cocaine boom changed everything. The drug flooded poor neighborhoods, turning addiction into currency and violence into routine. The 18th Street Gang saw opportunity. While older gangs fought over pride and borders, 18th Street learned to fight over distribution and money. They built connections with local dealers, then with larger suppliers. Drug money flowed in fast, and so did weapons. The gang began to arm itself with semi-automatic pistols and rifles smuggled from across the border. The small-time hustlers of Pico Union were becoming businessmen of the underworld. But with expansion came war. Rival gangs, especially MS-13, another rising power of Central American origin, started competing for territory. What began as localized fights quickly escalated into open street battles that turned entire neighborhoods into war zones. Police helicopters became a nightly soundtrack in Los Angeles, hovering over the city's south and west sides like vultures. The media labeled them super gangs, a term that both terrified the public and fueled the gang's ego. For the members, being feared meant being powerful. Law enforcement responded with aggressive crackdowns. The LAPD's crash units, the community resources against street hoodlums, were formed to dismantle gangs through raids, surveillance, and mass arrests. The idea was to cut the head off the snake, but 18th Street had no single head. When one clique fell, another absorbed its members. The prison system became an extension of the streets, a place where the gang's influence only deepened. Incarcerated members met others from different neighborhoods, shared contacts, traded information, and coordinated from behind bars. Prison didn't weaken 18th Street, it refined it. By the late 1980s, what had once been a disorganized group of youths had evolved into a disciplined network spanning multiple states. There were 18th Street cliques not only in Los Angeles, but in San Diego, Las Vegas, Phoenix, and even as far as Washington, D.C. The gang's graffiti became a form of communication, a territorial language understood by thousands. In every major city where immigrants struggled, 18th Street was there, offering belonging wrapped in danger. It was during this era that tattoos became sacred symbols of identity. The number 18, the Roman numerals 68, or the word Dieciocho, inked across chests and arms, became marks of loyalty that could never be erased. Each tattoo told a story of survival, of violence, of a family that demanded blood as proof of faith. Members were often jumped in, enduring brutal initiation beatings that lasted 18 seconds, though sometimes much longer. The pain wasn't punishment, it was a baptism. It separated the outsiders from those willing to die for the cause. Meanwhile, the city's media turned the 18th Street Gang into a dark legend. News reports described them as the most dangerous street gang in Los Angeles. Politicians used their rise as justification for harsher laws, longer sentences, and mass deportations. But what none of them understood was that this reaction would fuel the gang's next transformation. Every time a member was deported back to El Salvador or Guatemala, the infection spread. Each deportation became a seed planted in foreign soil, waiting to grow into a new clique. By the dawn of the 1990s, the 18th Street Gang had become a prototype for the future of organized crime. It operated without a central brain, but acted with collective instinct. It used fear as propaganda and loyalty as currency. Its members crossed languages, borders, and generations. In Los Angeles, it was no longer just a gang. It was a brand, a myth, and a warning. What began on one corner of Pico Union had evolved into a sophisticated machine driven by survival and chaos in equal measure. The city's attempts to control it only fed its expansion, turning each act of repression into fuel for growth. By the time law enforcement realized that they weren't fighting a gang, but an ecosystem, it was already too late. The 18th Street Gang had found its formula: recruit the excluded, weaponize identity, and let the system itself do the rest. When the gates of California's prisons closed behind them, the members of the 18th Street Gang believed they had reached the end of the line. What they didn't know was that they had just entered the place that would make them stronger than ever. The prison system, overcrowded and broken, became the unlikely incubator of one of the most organized and enduring criminal networks in modern history. It was here, in the echoing corridors of concrete and steel, that chaos would learn to speak the language of order, and the streets would evolve into an empire. By the late 1980s, California's prisons were overflowing. The war on gangs had filled the cells faster than the state could build them. 18th Street members, arrested for everything from petty theft to murder, found themselves scattered across institutions like Folsom, San Quentin, and Pelican Bay. They were surrounded by predators, rival gangs, and a prison hierarchy that operated according to its own brutal logic. At the top of that hierarchy was the Mexican Mafia, or La M, an organization that ruled the prison system like a shadow government. Every Latino inmate, whether they wanted it or not, was subject to its authority. For 18th Street members, survival meant learning to navigate this invisible empire. At first, they were seen as undisciplined street kids, reckless and loud, with no structure or respect for the old codes. But the longer they stayed, the more they adapted. Inside prison walls, respect wasn't given. It was earned through violence, loyalty, and the ability to follow orders. The Mexican Mafia saw potential in 18th Street's numbers. Their young soldiers were everywhere, fast, fearless, and disposable. If they could be controlled, they could be used. So, an unspoken alliance began to take shape. The 18th Street Gang would operate under the Sereno umbrella, pledging allegiance to La M. In return, they would receive protection, connections, and legitimacy. This pact transformed everything. 18th Street wasn't just a street gang anymore. It had become part of a wider network that linked the prison yards to the neighborhoods outside. Orders flowed both ways, from the cells to the streets, and from the streets back to the cells. The gang was evolving into a hybrid organism, half free, half caged, and entirely unstoppable. In prison, the gang learned what no street could teach: organization. Meetings were held in whispers through vents, coded letters, or messages passed in food trays. They learned discipline, how to operate with military efficiency, how to handle money, how to enforce rules without chaos. Violence became strategic. Murders weren't random acts of rage anymore. They were messages, carefully chosen to maintain power. The 18th Street members who emerged from prison weren't just criminals. They were trained operatives, fluent in the language of control. For many, incarceration became a rite of passage. Young recruits looked up to the men who had done time as veterans, as scholars of the underworld. Prison was no longer punishment. It was the university of crime. Inside, members learned how to run operations from behind bars, how to recruit new soldiers from among the lost and the desperate, and how to maintain communication with cliques on the outside. They discovered that violence wasn't the only way to rule. Fear could be managed like an economy, with rewards and punishments distributed according to loyalty. The prison also became the perfect place for cultural transmission. Through tattoos, slang, rituals, and music, 18th Street members kept their identity alive. The number 18 was carved into skin, drawn on walls, whispered in coded language. Even the smallest gestures, a handshake, a folded letter, a mark on a shoe, carried meaning. Every element reinforced belonging. To survive meant to belong, and to belong meant to obey. By the mid-1990s, the prison system had become the gang's command center. It was where leaders were made, disputes were settled, and alliances were negotiated. From within those walls, orders could reach across cities and even countries. The deportation policies of the United States only amplified this power. When members were sent back to Central America after serving time, they carried with them not just the street knowledge of Los Angeles, but the organizational discipline learned in prison. They brought the blueprint of an empire, forged in cells and sharpened by survival. Outside the prison walls, law enforcement was baffled. The 18th Street Gang seemed to grow stronger the more they attacked it. Crackdowns and mass arrests only increased the gang's reach, feeding its prison-based command. Prosecutors thought they were removing threats. Instead, they were creating new leaders. The system had become a factory, producing disciplined criminals at an industrial scale. What was meant to be a cage had turned into a classroom, and every lesson learned inside would soon reshape the streets. The connection between prisons and the streets was symbiotic. Money made from drug trafficking and extortion outside was used to support inmates inside, buying protection, influence, and loyalty. Inmates, in return, issued orders to ensure those outside remained loyal to the cause. It was an unbreakable circle, a perfect closed system. Even behind bars, 18th Street members could direct murders, coordinate drug deals, and settle territorial disputes thousands of miles away. The gang's reach had become almost invisible, and that made it invincible. The transformation was complete. The 18th Street Gang had become an institution. What began as a symbol of rebellion in Pico Union was now an entity that rivaled the state in organization. Its structure was fluid, decentralized, yet perfectly efficient, a living organism that could adapt to any environment. And prisons, meant to contain it, had become its breeding ground. For the young men still entering the system, prison was not the end, it was the beginning. They entered as followers and left as leaders. They learned how to manage fear, how to exploit systems, and how to build networks that crossed not only the walls of institutions, but the borders of nations. In time, the prison's influence would ripple far beyond California, reshaping entire regions of Central America. The lessons learned in those cold cells would fuel wars, massacres, and empires that governments could no longer control. Behind the bars, 18th Street found what it had always been searching for: identity and power. But it also found something darker, a way to replicate itself endlessly, feeding on the very systems meant to destroy it. The state built the prisons to contain the gang. Instead, the gang built its future inside them. By the early 1990s, Los Angeles had become a paradox, a city trying to heal while exporting its wounds to the rest of the world. In the shadows of palm trees and movie billboards, a quiet but devastating process was underway, one that would transform local street violence into a transnational epidemic. The US government, desperate to clean up its cities, began to deport thousands of undocumented immigrants with criminal records. Among them were hundreds of members of the 18th Street Gang. What began as a policy of law and order would end up seeding some of the most dangerous criminal networks in modern history. For American politicians, deportation seemed like a simple solution. If the problem came from immigrants, send them back. Planes filled with young men in shackles took off from Los Angeles International Airport, landing in countries that many of them barely remembered. They had been children when they fled the civil wars of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. Now, they were returning as hardened gang members, trained in the culture of Los Angeles and the discipline of California's prisons. They were, in a sense, soldiers without a nation, fluent in English and Spanish, shaped by two worlds, belonging fully to neither. When they stepped onto the streets of San Salvador, Tegucigalpa, or Guatemala City, what they found wasn't the homeland they had imagined. These were countries scarred by decades of civil conflict, economic collapse, and political corruption. The police forces were weak, the social fabric shredded, and the governments ill-prepared to absorb waves of deportees with violent pasts. To make things worse, the returning gang members were stigmatized as contaminated by American culture. They were outsiders once again, rejected by both the state and society, just as they had been in Los Angeles. And rejection, once again, bred rebellion. At first, they gathered in small groups recognizable by their tattoos and their language. Local youths fascinated by their style, the baggy clothes, the graffiti, the hand signs, started to imitate them. The deportees brought not just the image of gang life, but its entire operating system. The codes, the hierarchies, the rituals of loyalty and fear. Within a few years, the 18th Street Gang had established its first cliques in San Salvador and Guatemala City. They called them programas, extensions of the mother organization in LA, but soon these branches would grow far beyond their origins, adapting to local realities and becoming their own monsters. The timing could not have been worse. Central America in the 1990s was in ruins. The peace treaties that ended the civil wars had left thousands of ex-combatants unemployed, armed and traumatized. Weapons were cheap, loyalty was for sale, and violence had become a language everyone understood. Into this vacuum walked the deportees, young men with no future, no fear, and a new kind of discipline learned in the prisons of the United States. The local youth, restless and angry, found in them something to believe in. The 18th Street Gang became not just a criminal group, but a culture, a form of belonging in societies where the state had failed to provide one. Soon, the streets of San Salvador began to resemble the alleys of Los Angeles. Malls were tagged with 18, 18, and Dieciocho. Neighborhoods divided themselves into territories, zonas calientes, where the gang's control was absolute. Extortion replaced commerce, loyalty replaced law. Those who disobeyed were punished with public violence meant to instill terror. The same patterns that had once defined Pico Union now spread across entire cities. The virus of the 18th Street Gang had found fertile soil. Meanwhile, U.S. officials congratulated themselves on lowering gang violence statistics in Los Angeles. They didn't realize that they had simply exported the problem, like a corporation outsourcing production to another country. The deportation policy turned local street gangs into transnational networks. Deportees kept communication alive with their counterparts in California through letters, family connections, and later through early digital channels. The gang's influence no longer had borders. What started as graffiti on a wall in LA now stretched from the barrios of Compton to the slums of San Salvador. The consequences were catastrophic. Central American governments, lacking resources and coordination, responded with militarization instead of rehabilitation. They launched mano dura, iron fist policies, mass arrests, harsh sentencing, and public humiliation of gang members. But just like in Los Angeles, repression only made the problem worse. Prisons filled up, and once again, incarceration turned into education. The same process that had shaped the 18th Street Gang in California now repeated itself in Central America. The prison yards of San Salvador became command centers, the cells became offices, and every deportee behind bars became a recruiter. By the 2000s, the 18th Street Gang had evolved into something new, something terrifyingly efficient. It wasn't just a street gang anymore. It was a transnational criminal network with operations across borders. The gang's members moved drugs, laundered money, smuggled people, and collected war taxes from small businesses and bus drivers. Their reach extended from Honduras to Mexico and into the United States, where returning migrants carried stories, money, and loyalty back and forth. The gang was no longer fighting for a neighborhood. It was fighting for an economy. For many of the young men growing up in the post-war chaos of Central America, joining the 18th Street Gang wasn't a choice. It was survival. In communities abandoned by the state, the gang provided protection, income, and identity. The logic was simple. Either you were with them or you were against them. Those who resisted paid the price. Families fled their homes by the thousands, seeking asylum in the very country that had once deported the violence to theirs. The circle was complete. The U.S. exported the gang, and the victims of the gang returned to the U.S. as refugees. International agencies began to call it what it was, a cycle of systemic failure. Every deportation created a new seed of violence. Every crackdown created new leaders. Every prison became a breeding ground. By the time governments realized what had happened, it was already too late. The 18th Street Gang had adapted to its new environment with Darwinian precision. Its members no longer needed Los Angeles to survive. They had entire nations at their disposal, from the smog-filled streets of Pico Union to the dusty barrios of San Salvador. The story had come full circle. What began as a rebellion of forgotten youths had become a multinational criminal enterprise. The US had tried to erase its gangs by deporting them, but in doing so, it had globalized them. The 18 that once stood for a street number now stood for something far larger, a symbol of how violence, once born of neglect, could travel farther than anyone ever intended. By the turn of the millennium, what began as a handful of rejected teenagers in Los Angeles had transformed into one of the most feared and far-reaching criminal networks in the Western Hemisphere. The 18th Street Gang, La Dieciocho, was no longer just a street phenomenon. It had become a transnational empire of violence and commerce, connecting neighborhoods, prisons, and entire nations through an invisible web of fear, loyalty, and blood. The organization had outgrown its birthplace. It now moved like a shadow through cities and borders, driven not just by rage, but by profit. The early 2000s marked the age of professionalization. The chaos of the 1980s and 1990s gave way to a more structured, calculated form of crime. The deported cliques in Central America and the homegrown ones in Los Angeles began to evolve independently, but their goals were synchronized: control territory, dominate the drug market, and expand influence. Money, not pride, became the new currency of respect. The 18th Street Gang learned from cartels, mafias, and even terrorist cells. They adopted decentralized leadership models, used encrypted communication, and turned the idea of a gang into something more corporate. There were no official uniforms, but there were rules. There was no headquarters, but there was order. In El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, the gang took advantage of weak institutions. Police were underpaid and corruptible. Judges feared retaliation. Politicians were either complicit or powerless. In many barrios, the gang was the only authority that mattered. They established invisible borders known as fronteras, dividing cities block by block. Crossing these invisible lines without permission could mean death. The extortion economy, known locally as La Renta, became their main source of income. Every shop owner, bus driver, and vendor paid tribute. The payments funded weapons, bribes, and the gang's internal structure. The state might control the capital, but the gang controlled the streets. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, 18th Street's influence persisted. Though law enforcement had fragmented many of the original cliques, their legacy endured through family connections and prison networks. The gang diversified its operations: drug distribution, identity theft, human trafficking, and even arms smuggling. The same routes that once carried cocaine north from Colombia now carried people, weapons, and dollars back south. It was a self-sustaining ecosystem where money and blood flowed in both directions. What made 18th Street unique was its adaptability. Unlike traditional cartels, it didn't rely on a single leader. Power was distributed across hundreds of local commanders, each with autonomy to manage their territory. If one fell, another rose. The organization functioned like a hydra: cut off one head and two more appeared. This resilience frustrated governments and intelligence agencies. Traditional strategies, arresting leaders, freezing assets, deploying soldiers, barely scratched the surface. The gang had become viral, surviving by embedding itself into the social DNA of every place it touched. And with growth came a new kind of brutality. Competition with rival gangs, especially MS-13, escalated into total war. The violence wasn't random anymore, it was symbolic. Bodies left on roadsides with warning signs, public executions, burned buses, all served a purpose. Fear became propaganda. In El Salvador, homicide rates soared to levels comparable to war zones. Journalists and sociologists began calling it La Guerra Invisible, the invisible war. But for those living inside the territories, it was anything but invisible. It was daily life. Every sound of a motorcycle could mean a hitman approaching. Every knock at the door could mean an ultimatum. The gang also began to intersect with the drug trade in more sophisticated ways. While they didn't control the large-scale cocaine routes dominated by cartels, they provided essential services: security, distribution, and enforcement. They became middlemen between cartels and local markets, ensuring the flow of narcotics through urban centers. Their local knowledge, discipline, and fearsome reputation made them indispensable. Cartels preferred to work with 18th Street rather than against it, understanding that in the densely populated neighborhoods of Central America, no one moved without their permission. By the mid-2010s, the gang had developed connections across multiple continents. Members in the United States sent remittances to imprisoned leaders in El Salvador. Those funds financed recruitment, weapons, and the support of members' families. Cells appeared in Mexico, Nicaragua, and even Spain, carried by migration and globalization. Law enforcement agencies began to realize that they weren't dealing with a gang in the traditional sense, but with a fluid, borderless network of organized crime, a hybrid between street culture and cartel economics. The human cost was staggering. Communities became prisons without bars. Children grew up under the shadow of gang rule, where every choice was a potential death sentence: join, flee, or die. Families were torn apart. Parents sent their sons north in desperate attempts to save them, only to see them recruited by the same organization they were running from once they reached Los Angeles or Houston. The cycle was complete, an Ouroboros of violence eating its own tail. International governments struggled to respond. The United States labeled the 18th Street Gang a transnational criminal organization, but definitions did little to change reality. Massive police operations like Operation Raging Bull in 2017 led to hundreds of arrests, yet the structure remained intact. It wasn't an empire with a palace. It was an empire of whispers and walls. The gang had learned to survive invisibly, camouflaged within the same social chaos that birthed it. Inside prisons, leaders continued to issue orders through coded messages. Outside, new recruits took oaths in candlelit ceremonies, pledging allegiance to a cause older than themselves. Tattoos became both symbols of faith and death sentences, badges that could get you killed by rivals or targeted by police. But for the members, they were marks of identity, of history, of defiance. The 18th Street Gang had outlived every government campaign, every police chief's promise, every journalist's expose. It had become eternal, not because of its strength, but because of the weakness of the world around it. As the years went on, 18th Street refined its empire of blood into a system. It taxed the poor, negotiated with the powerful, and infiltrated the very institutions meant to destroy it. Its leaders understood something that many politicians didn't. Fear is a currency, and in places where hope is scarce, it spends easily. For the people who lived under its rule, there was no escape, only the illusion of choice. The story of the 18th Street Gang had come full circle again. Born from exclusion, raised in violence, educated in prison, and exported by policy, it now stood as one of the world's most sophisticated criminal ecosystems. Its empire wasn't built on ideology or politics, but on the universal truths of power and survival. It was, in its own dark way, globalization's most brutal child. And as it looked toward the future, one question lingered over governments and citizens alike. How do you kill something that was born from everything you created? The world has changed since the days when graffiti on Los Angeles walls first spelled out 68. The city that once gave birth to the 18th Street Gang now sits beneath a digital sky, a world connected not by streets but by screens. Yet while the skyline transformed, the essence of 18th Street did not vanish. It adapted. Like a virus finding new hosts, the gang evolved with the times, blending old-world brutality with new-age technology. What began as survival in the alleys of Pico Union had become a global criminal intelligence, operating as comfortably in cyberspace as it once did on street corners. In the early 2010s, law enforcement across the Americas noticed something strange. The graffiti was fading, but the violence wasn't. Traditional turf wars were no longer as visible, yet extortion money still flowed, drugs still moved, and the recruitment of new members continued at alarming rates. The 18th Street Gang had entered a new era of invisibility. They no longer needed to shout their existence through walls of spray paint. Now they could whisper through encrypted apps and social networks. Telegram groups replaced alley meetings. Orders crossed borders instantly. The street code of loyalty and silence now lived inside chatrooms that police couldn't trace. The first digital adaptation was communication. Smuggled cell phones inside Central American prisons became lifelines between leaders behind bars and their armies outside. Messages written in code, hidden behind emojis or religious phrases, allowed operations to continue seamlessly. Extortion targets received threats through WhatsApp calls. Victims could hear the sound of prison echoing behind the voice, the hum of fluorescent lights, the clang of metal doors, a haunting reminder that control no longer required physical presence. The gang had turned confinement into command. Then came recruitment. Social media became the new alleyway. Teenagers scrolling through Facebook, TikTok, or Instagram encountered videos glorifying the vida loca, the crazy life of money, respect, and fear. Young people from barrios in Honduras to suburbs in Maryland saw the same digital mirage: brotherhood, fast cash, power. The gang exploited the same psychological vacuum that had created it decades earlier: poverty, exclusion, and a yearning to belong. But now it could reach anyone with a smartphone. One viral video could do what months of street persuasion once required. The gang had found its new weapon: influence. Money, too, began to flow differently. The traditional cash economy of renter and street sales merged with digital systems. Members used cryptocurrency to move funds across borders, buying weapons, paying smugglers, or laundering money through online gambling sites. Small-time hackers and programmers joined the ranks, teaching the organization how to erase digital footprints or track law enforcement patterns. What once required muscle could now be done with a laptop. The gang's reach had expanded from alleys to algorithms. But even as the gang modernized, its violence remained medieval. In Central America, the invisible borders still ruled daily life. In Los Angeles, cliques still fought for corners. The new generation blended the physical and digital worlds seamlessly, posting smiling selfies one moment, ordering executions the next. The codes of loyalty hadn't changed, only the methods had. Betrayal was punished as brutally as ever, and revenge could now travel across oceans in seconds. The gang had become a ghost, half in the real world, half in the digital one, impossible to eradicate because it was everywhere and nowhere at once. Law enforcement tried to keep up. International task forces, data tracking software, and cyber surveillance units all aimed to dismantle the gang's transnational operations. The United States, El Salvador, and Guatemala exchanged intelligence, coordinated raids, and froze assets. Yet, each victory seemed temporary. Arrest one leader and another would emerge. This time younger, smarter, and better connected. The gang's greatest strength had always been its adaptability, and the digital era only amplified that. They no longer needed physical territory to exist. Their presence now lived in encrypted data, offshore servers, and social fear. The political dimension of the 18th Street Empire also deepened. In some Central American towns, candidates quietly paid the gang for peace during elections. In others, Members infiltrated local police or municipal offices, controlling public works contracts, influencing judicial processes, and even distributing aid during disasters, echoing the cartel strategy of blending terror with benevolence. To the poor, they were protectors. To the state, they were a parasite. To themselves, they were a government born out of necessity. The gang that once rebelled against exclusion had now become its own form of authority, a shadow state ruling through fear. At the same time, migration crises across the Americas fed the cycle anew. Families fleeing gang violence sought refuge in the United States, only to end up in neighborhoods already touched by 18th Street's influence. Their children entered schools where gang recruiters were already waiting. The line between victim and perpetrator blurred once more. Every generation seemed condemned to inherit the same curse, to run from violence, only to meet it again on the other side of the border. And yet, despite its global scale, the heart of the 18th Street story remains profoundly human. It is the story of rejection and belonging, of how societies create their own monsters through neglect and inequality. The gang did not invent poverty, racism, or exile. It grew out of them. Every crackdown, every deportation, every prison sentence was a mirror reflecting the same truth. Violence thrives where hope dies. The 18th Street Gang is not just a criminal entity. It is a symptom, a scar on the social fabric of two continents that forgot how to heal. Today, the gang's influence reaches from Los Angeles to London, from San Salvador to Madrid. It operates through 1,000 faces and 1,000 usernames. It is a brand, a mythology, a warning etched into the global psyche. Governments fight it with weapons and data, but few dare to confront the disease beneath, the inequality, the broken systems, the forgotten youth who keep the fire alive. The streets have changed names, but the echo remains, the whisper of Dieciocho, carried by time, by technology, by pain. The 18th Street Gang is the story of evolution in its darkest form. From the cracked sidewalks of Pico Union to the encrypted networks of the 21st century, it has proven that power doesn't need legitimacy, it only needs survival. It is the ghost of every system that failed to care, every government that punished instead of healed. And as long as the world remains divided between those who belong and those who don't, the number 18 will continue to grow, not just as a gang, but as a symbol of everything we refuse to see. If this story opened your eyes, don't let it fade into silence. Every like, comment, and share helps more people understand the hidden roots of violence and the human cost behind it. Subscribe to our channel for more real stories that reveal what others prefer to hide. From the cartels of Mexico to the gangs of Los Angeles, we uncover the truths buried beneath headlines and history. Turn on notifications, stay alert, and never forget. The past doesn't stay buried.